Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the life of a man who literally built the modern world, but did so through this terrifying mix of constant danger, unparalleled genius, and honestly, what some might call near insanity. We are talking about Isambard Kingdom Brunel. If you really want to understand how modern transport was forged, you have to understand the mind of a guy who just flat out refused to accept the word impossible.
To really grasp the sheer scale of his ambition, I want to start by setting the scene near the very end of his life. Picture this. It's January 31, 1858, and we're standing on the banks of the River Thames in London. There are thousands of people gathered around, just watching in absolute awe. Sitting right there on the riverbank is this iron leviathan. It's a ship of a size that completely defies logic, and after several agonizing failed attempts, it's finally being forced into the water. 19,000 tons. That was the weight of the SS Great Eastern. It was the largest ship ever built at the time. This unprecedented, colossal project that had basically become its creator's absolute obsession. But here is the really tragic irony of this monumental achievement. The designer of this iron beast would suffer a stroke and die just a year later. He never even got to see his ultimate creation set sail on her maiden voyage. So you gotta ask yourself, who was Isambard Kingdom Brunel? How did a single individual push the boundaries of engineering to such extremes that it ultimately cost him his life? Well, to understand the tragic end of his story, we have to rewind to his origins. Chapter 1. Taming the Thames, the foundation of a visionary.
Isambard was born in 1806 to a brilliant engineer father, Marc Brunel. Growing up watching his dad invent everything from military boots to pulley blocks, really instilled this relentless drive in young Isambard. Now, his real start, and let me tell you, it was an absolute trial by fire, was working alongside his father on the Thames Tunnel. They kicked things off in 1825 using Marc's newly patented tunneling shield. But wow, it was a nightmare. In May 1827, the riverbed collapsed, just completely flooding the tunnel. Then, in January 1828, a second devastating flood hit. 6 workers died, and 21-year-old Isambard himself barely escaped. He narrowly avoided drowning, was severely injured, and actually ended up bedridden for months. The whole project literally paused for 7 years just to scrape together the funds to keep going, before finally opening in 1843 as the world's first underwater tunnel. While he was stuck in bed recovering from those near-death experiences, Brunel kept a private journal. In it, he wrote about dreaming up what he called castles in the air. He actually developed these deeply morbid sentiments, which, makes sense given the trauma, but it was sharply contrasted by this bombastic, almost arrogant ambition. He was writing about wanting to command fleets and literally take over islands. This was really the birth of his flawed genius. He realized life was incredibly fragile, so his creations, they needed to be immortal. Chapter 2. The Railway Revolution. Connecting a Nation. In 1833, at just 27 years old, Brunel becomes the chief engineer of the Great Western Railway. But he didn't just want to build a railway. He wanted absolute perfection. He engineered what famously became known as Brunel's billiards table. He refused to cut corners or weave around hills just to save a few bucks. He wanted perfectly straight, flat routes so his trains could reach speeds no one had ever seen before. He built these massive, expensive monuments like the Warncliffe Viaduct. He blasted the Box Tunnel through 2 miles of solid, hard limestone. People legitimately thought he was crazy. In fact, there was a science professor named Dionysius Lardner who actually went to Parliament and claimed that if brakes failed in the Box Tunnel, the train would hit 120 miles per hour and the air pressure would literally suffocate the passengers. Brunel had to use raw physics to refute these wild claims and prove human beings could actually travel that fast safely. So the crucial point here is that Brunel looked at transport completely differently than his rivals, and this sparked the infamous gauge war. Rival engineers, like George and Robert Stephenson, were building narrow gauge tracks, about 4 feet 8.5 inches wide. Their main focus? Moving coal as cheaply as possible. But Brunel envisioned high-speed, luxury public transport, so he designed a broad gauge, nearly 7 feet wide, which allowed the carriages to sit down between the wheels. This lowered the center of gravity and gave passengers an incredibly smooth, fast, and comfortable ride. But, as we know, vision doesn't always win out against sheer pragmatism. Data from the 1845 Royal Commission paints a pretty stark picture. Brunel literally staged a contest where his broad-gauge train hauled 80 tons of freight at 53 miles per hour flawlessly, while the narrow gauge derailed carrying less weight. He won the battle, but he lost the gauge war. Why?
while there were already 1,901 miles of narrow-gauge track in Britain, compared to just 274 miles of Brunel's broad gauge. The Stephensons just had a massive first-mover advantage. Standardizing the country's network meant Brunel's beautiful, far superior gauge was ultimately doomed.
Did losing that war slow him down? Not even a little bit. He hated dirty, heavy steam locomotives anyway, so he started experimenting with something that sounds incredibly sci-fi for the 1840s, the atmospheric railway. He built a system in Devon that was powered entirely by air pressure, using a tube laid right between the tracks. It was such a brilliantly elegant concept, but honestly, the engineering materials of the time just weren't up to the task. The whole thing failed after a year, proving to be this insurmountable, hugely costly challenge. His drive for innovation was completely relentless, but sometimes, it blinded him to reality.
Chapter 3: Conquering the Oceans, Beyond the Tracks. For Brunel, hitting the edge of the land wasn't the end of the line. It was just a new surface to build on. When the board of the Great Western Railway complained about the length of the railway, Brunel reportedly joked that it wasn't long enough. He proposed a completely seamless integrated transport network. He pitched this incredible transatlantic vision. Step 1, you buy a single ticket in London. Step 2, you ride his railway in total luxury straight to the port of Bristol. Step 3, you step off the train, walk onto his steamship, and sail directly to New York. It was a masterclass in end-to-end user experience, literally a century ahead of its time. And he created a whole new steamship company just to make this dream a reality. His ambition just escalated so rapidly. Looking at his 3 Leviathans, you can see these massive technological leaps. First up, the SS Great Western. It had a wooden hull, paddle steamer, and it established the world's very first regular transatlantic service. Amazing, right? But then he pivots sharply with the SS Great Britain. Massive leap in size, built entirely of iron and powered by a screw propeller. Game changer. Finally, the monster we talked about earlier, the SS Great Eastern. Built of steel, double-hulled, utilizing both paddles and propellers and stretching over 200 meters long. The scale and the risk just compounded with every single project he took on. But pushing boundaries brings massive risks. In 1846, his absolute state-of-the-art iron ship, the SS Great Britain, was run aground off the coast of Ireland by its captain in heavy rain. When Brunel finally traveled there to see it for himself, he was heartbroken and enraged. He described his masterpiece as lying like a useless saucepan kicking about on the most exposed shore you can imagine. That disaster completely bankrupted his steamship company. Chapter 4: The Price of Genius, The Final Toll. Moving into the 1850s, Brunel was a certified superstar. But the continuous financial stress, the massive physical burdens, and the constant battles with corporate directors began to systematically destroy his health. Despite suffering from failing kidneys, the world simply wouldn't let him rest. He was in demand globally. When Florence Nightingale complained about the horrific sanitary conditions in the Crimean War, Brunel designed a prefabricated flat-pack hospital in just 6 days. 6 days! And it drastically reduced death rates. He was consulting for railways in India and Australia. He designed the stunning iron and glass architecture at London's Paddington Station, which, by the way, is still used today, and he built the magnificent Royal Albert Bridge over the River Tamar. His genius was everywhere, but he was spreading himself incredibly, dangerously thin. And all of this culminated in the Great Eastern. The launch process was agonizing. Because of its sheer 200-meter length, they actually had to build the massive hull parallel to the river. The shipyard went into foreclosure during construction. Brunel was constantly fighting his builder, John Scott Russell. And when it was finally time to launch, total disaster. There were 4 failed, incredibly stressful attempts where this massive ship barely moved an inch. Finally, after consulting with his old rival, Robert Stephenson, they had to force the Leviathan into the water using 18 massive hydraulic rams. The stress of this whole ordeal completely broke whatever physical strength Brunel had left in him. He suffered a stroke just days before the ship's maiden voyage. Bedridden once again, he lay there awaiting news of her departure. But on September 9, 1859, disaster struck one last time. Because there was no overall commander in charge while Brunel was absent, a valve was carelessly left closed and the forward funnel exploded. It killed 5 stokers. When the news of this tragedy reached the frail Brunel, the shock was simply too much to bear. It pushed him past the point of no return. He died just days later at the age of 53. His colleague, Daniel Gooch, wrote this really powerful summary in his diary when he heard of Brunel's death. He wrote, "The commercial world thought him extravagant, but although he was so, great things are not done by those who sit down and count the cost of every thought and act.
I think that encapsulates his legacy beautifully. Brunel didn't care about the budget. He cared about paving the foundations for a connected, modern world. He drove the technology that eventually allowed tens of millions to migrate and travel. Which really leaves us to ponder this final question. Was his relentless quest for perfection the necessary blueprint for the incredible modern infrastructure we rely on today? Or was it, in the end, a ruinous personal obsession that blinded him to reality and cost him his life? It's a fascinating look at the messy, extravagant human cost of monumental progress. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope it leaves you looking at the bridges, railways, and ships around you in a totally different light. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.